Money can't buy everything, but sometimes it can buy justice. What happens when a billionaire discovers that the woman who raised him with love was being destroyed by the very people he trusted most? This is the story of Marcus Chen, a tech mogul worth $12 billion, who thought he knew everything about his perfect life until one hidden camera revealed a truth so shocking that it would make him question everyone around him. Behind the marble walls of his mansion, a 60-year-old woman named Rosa Martinez was fighting a battle no one should ever fight alone. She had been more than a maid to Marcus. She had been his second mother, his protector, his source of comfort when his real mother was too busy building an empire to notice her son's tears. But Rosa was hiding something that would break Marcus's heart and ignite a fury he never knew he possessed. When Marcus finally discovered what was happening to the woman who had sacrificed everything for his family, he realized that all his money, all his power, and all his success meant nothing if he couldn't protect the person who had protected him first. What Rosa did next would shock everyone, including Marcus himself, and prove that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of courage. This is a story about loyalty, betrayal, justice, and the unbreakable bond between two people from completely different worlds who discovered that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about love, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Marcus Chen stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor. The city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board, all lights and endless possibilities. At 35, he had built Chen Technologies from nothing into a $12 billion empire that revolutionized how people connected across the globe. His apps were on every smartphone, his software powered half the world's communication systems, and his name appeared on Forbes lists with predictable regularity. But success had a price that Marcus was only beginning to understand. His phone buzzed with another urgent message from his assistant. Board meeting in 10 minutes. Merger documents needed review. Stock prices demanded attention. The machine of his life ran with perfect efficiency, leaving little room for the messy, unpredictable parts of being human. Marcus straightened his Italian suit and grabbed his leather portfolio, pushing thoughts of anything beyond quarterly projections from his mind. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. Marcus found himself thinking about Rosa Martinez, the woman who had been part of his family for over 20 years. She had started as his mother's housekeeper when Marcus was 15, but had become something much more important, a steady presence in a household where his parents were always traveling, always working, always somewhere else. Rosa had been the one to pack his lunches, help with homework, and listen to his teenage complaints about feeling invisible in his own home. Even now, with his mother Patricia long since divorced from his father and living in her own wing of the family estate, Rosa remained. She maintained the sprawling mansion where Marcus had grown up, the same house where he now lived when he wasn't traveling for business. It was Rosa who made sure his favorite coffee was ready each morning, who remembered that he liked his shirts pressed with light starch, who asked about his day when he came home to an empty house. Marcus realized with uncomfortable clarity that Rosa knew more about his daily life than anyone else in his world. She was 60 years old now, her black hair streaked with silver, her kind face lined with decades of caring for others before herself. She had never married, never had children of her own, dedicating her life instead to the Chen family, with a loyalty that Marcus had always taken for granted. The board meeting dragged on for 3 hours. Quarterly reports, expansion plans, competitor analysis, the familiar rhythm of corporate decision-making that had become Marcus's second language. But today he found his attention wandering. When the CFO presented profit margins for their latest acquisition, Marcus found himself wondering if Rosa had eaten lunch. When the head of marketing outlined their global campaign strategy, he thought about the way Rosa's arthritis seemed worse lately, how she sometimes winced when she thought no one was looking. After the meeting, Marcus made an impulsive decision. Instead of staying late to review contracts as he usually did, he left the office early. To drive home through the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills gave him time to think about why he felt so unsettled. His mother lived in Santa Barbara now, coming to Los Angeles only for social events and charity galas. His father had remarried and moved to New York years ago. The vast house that had once been filled with the chaos of family life was now quiet, maintained by Rosa and a small staff who came during the day. Marcus pulled through the wrought iron gates of his estate and parked in the circular driveway. The Mediterranean-style mansion rose before him, all cream-colored stone and red tile roofs, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. It was beautiful, impressive, and completely empty of the warmth that Rosa somehow managed to create despite its size. He entered through the front door and called out, "Rosa, I'm home early today." No response. That was unusual. Rosa always greeted him when he arrived, usually appearing from whatever room she was working in with a smile and questions about his day. Marcus set down his briefcase and walked through the marble foyer toward the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt different somehow. Marcus couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but something was off. He passed the formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and antique table that seated 12 but was rarely used. The living room with its white furniture and carefully arranged art looked untouched, as if it were a museum display rather than a place where people actually lived. In the kitchen, Marcus found signs of Rosa's presence. A coffee cup in the sink, a dish towel folded neatly by the stove, but still no Rosa herself. He called out again, louder this time. "Rosa? Where are you?" A faint sound reached him from somewhere deeper in the house. It might have been voices, or perhaps the television. Marcus followed the sound through the butler's pantry and down a hallway he rarely used, one that led to the service areas of the house where Rosa had her own small apartment. The voices became clearer as he approached. Marcus could hear Rosa speaking, her voice strained in a way he'd never heard before. There was someone with her, a man's voice that Marcus didn't recognize. The conversation was in rapid Spanish, too fast for Marcus to follow with his limited knowledge of the language. But he could hear the tone, tense, aggressive, frightening. Marcus slowed his steps, unsure whether he should interrupt or not. Rosa's apartment was her private space, and he had always respected that boundary. But something in her voice made him pause and listen more carefully. The man's voice rose, harsh and demanding. Rosa responded with what sounded like pleading. Marcus caught a few words he recognized. Dinero meant money. Por favor meant please. His stomach clenched as he realized that whatever was happening in Rosa's apartment, it wasn't a friendly conversation. Marcus reached for his phone, unsure who he should call or what he should do. He had lived his entire adult life solving problems with money, connections, and carefully worded contracts. But this felt different, more immediate and personal than anything his wealth could easily fix. The sound of something breaking, glass hitting the floor, made the decision for him. Marcus abandoned caution and knocked firmly on Rosa's door. "Rosa, is everything okay?" The voices inside stopped immediately. Marcus could hear movement, shuffling footsteps, a whispered exchange too quiet to understand. After what felt like an eternity, Rosa opened the door. Marcus barely recognized her. Rosa's usually neat appearance was disheveled, her hair escaping from its normal bun. Her face was pale except for a red mark on her left cheek that looked suspiciously like the aftermath of a slap. Most shocking of all were her eyes, filled with a fear so intense that Marcus felt his own heart rate spike in response. "Marcus," she said, forcing a smile that fooled no one. "You are home early today. I was just cleaning." Behind her, Marcus could see into her small living room. A man stood near the window, his back to the door. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of lean build that suggested either an athlete or someone who worked with his hands. Even from behind, Marcus could sense tension radiating from the stranger like heat from a furnace. "Who's your friend?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice casual despite the alarm bells going off in his head. Rosa's smile flickered and died. This is my nephew, Carlos. He was just leaving." Carlos turned around slowly, and Marcus got his first good look at the man who had been making Rosa so afraid. He had Rosa's dark eyes and olive skin, but where her face was kind and open, his was hard and calculating. There was something predatory in the way he looked at Marcus, as if he were evaluating a potential threat or opportunity. "So you're the famous Marcus Chen," Carlos said, in accented but perfectly clear English. "Rosa talks about you all the time, like you're her own son or something." There was mockery in his voice, a sneer that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. But more concerning was the way Rosa flinched at her nephew's words, as if they contained some hidden threat that Marcus wasn't catching. "I didn't know Rosa had family in Los Angeles," Marcus said carefully. "Are you visiting from Mexico?" Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I've been around for a while now. Just took me some time to reconnect with my dear aunt here. Family is so important, don't you think? Blood is thicker than water and all that." The way he emphasized certain words made Marcus feel like he was missing crucial parts of the conversation. Rosa remained silent, her hands twisted together in front of her, in a gesture of nervous energy that Marcus had never seen from her before. "Well," Marcus said, "I don't want to interrupt your family time. Rosa, when you have a moment, could you help me find those financial documents I asked you to file? They're for tomorrow morning's meeting." It was a lie, but it gave Rosa an excuse to leave with him if she wanted to. Marcus watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of what she needed from him. Carlos stepped forward, moving closer to Rosa in a way that made her shrink back slightly. Actually, Rosa and I weren't quite finished with our conversation. Were we, Tia? The word tia, Spanish for aunt, should have sounded affectionate. Instead, it sounded like a warning. Marcus felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Rosa had been taking care of him and his family for 20 years. She had never asked for anything beyond her salary and basic respect. She had been present for every important moment of his adolescence and young adulthood, offering quiet support and unconditional care. The idea that someone, anyone, was making her afraid in her own home was unacceptable. The documents are pretty urgent, Marcus said, putting subtle emphasis on the words. Company policy, you know. Everything needs to be filed according to very specific procedures. Rosa caught on immediately. Of course, Marcus. The filing system. Very important. She took a small step toward the door, toward Marcus and safety. Carlos moved to block her path. The filling can wait. Rosa and I are discussing some family business that really can't be postponed. The threat was barely veiled now. Marcus could see that Rosa was trapped between her nephew's demands and her loyalty to Marcus. She looked back and forth between the two men like a trapped animal searching for escape. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and speed-dialed his head of security, a former police detective named James Morrison who handled all of Chen Technologies' safety protocols. James, I need you to come to the house right away. There's a situation I need help with. Carlos's expression shifted from mockery to genuine anger. That's not necessary, Mr. Stowe. Chen, this is just a family matter. Nothing that concerns you or your security team. Anything that concerns Rosa concerns me, Marcus replied firmly. She's been part of my family for 20 years. That makes her family business my business too. Rosa's eyes filled with tears at his words. Marcus realized that in all the years she had worked for them, no one had ever explicitly acknowledged that she was more than hired help. She was family, and family protected each other. Carlos seemed to realize that the situation had shifted beyond his control. He looked between Marcus and Rosa, calculating odds and possibilities. Whatever he had been planning to accomplish today was clearly not going to happen with Marcus and potentially a security team standing in his way. This isn't over, Carlos said quietly, speaking to Rosa in Spanish before switching back to English for Marcus's benefit. I'll be back, Tia. We still have things to discuss. He pushed past Marcus and strode down the hallway, his footsteps angry and sharp against the marble floor. Marcus heard the front door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Rosa collapsed into a chair, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands. Marcus knelt beside her chair, unsure how to offer comfort to the woman who had comforted him so many times over the years. Rosa, talk to me. What's going on? Who was that man really? Rosa looked up at him through her tears, and Marcus saw something in her expression that broke his heart. It was shame. Deep and painful. The kind that comes from being victimized and somehow blaming yourself for it. He is my nephew, she whispered. My sister's son. But Carlos is not. He is not a good man, Marcus. He is in trouble. Always in trouble. And now he thinks that because I work for you, because you are successful, that I have money to help him. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. What kind of trouble? Rosa shook her head. Bad trouble. Dangerous people. He owes money for drugs, for gambling. He says if I don't help him, something bad will happen to my sister's family in Mexico. He says he knows where they live, knows where my other nephews go to school. The picture became clearer and more horrifying. Carlos was using Rosa's love for her family as a weapon against her, demanding money she didn't have to solve problems she hadn't created. And Rosa, being Rosa, was trying to handle it alone, rather than burden anyone else with her troubles. How long has this been going on? Marcus asked. 3 months, Rosa admitted. At first, he just asked for small amounts, a few $100s here and there. I gave him money from my savings, thinking it would help, thinking it would make him go away. But it only made him want more. Marcus felt a cold anger building in his chest. While he had been focused on stock prices and board meetings, Rosa had been living in fear in her own home, being extorted by her own family member. The red mark on her cheek suggested that Carlos's methods were escalating beyond emotional manipulation. "Did he hit you?" Marcus asked quietly. Rosa's hand moved unconsciously to her cheek. "It was just once. When I told him I had no more savings to give him. He got angry, said I was lying, said I must have money hidden somewhere because I work for rich people." Marcus stood up, pacing Rosa's small living room as his mind raced through possibilities and solutions. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with a simple check or a legal contract. Carlos was a predator who had identified Rosa as vulnerable prey, and predators didn't usually stop hunting until they were forced to stop. "Rosa, you should have told me about this months ago. You don't have to handle this alone." She shook her head vigorously. "This is my family problem, Marcus, my shame. You have been so good to me, to my family. I could not bring my troubles to your door." "You're not bringing troubles to my door," Marcus said firmly. "You're trusting family to help family. And that's what we're going to do." James Morrison arrived 30 minutes later, a tall man with greying hair, and the kind of calm presence that came from years of handling crises. Marcus filled him in on the situation, while Rosa made coffee with shaking hands, grateful to have something to do with her nervous energy. "The first thing we need to do is document everything," James said. "Rosa, I need you to tell me exactly what Carlos has said and done, every threat he's made, every demand for money. We'll want to report this to the police." Rosa looked terrified at the mention of police. "But my family in Mexico, if Carlos gets angry..." "Carlos is already angry," Marcus pointed out. "And he's going to keep escalating until someone stops him. The best way to protect your family is to make sure he can't hurt anyone." Over the next 2 hours, a picture emerged of systematic harassment and extortion that made Marcus's stomach turn. Carlos had been visiting Rosa regularly, always when Marcus was at work. He had searched her apartment, looking for money or valuables to steal. He had threatened not just Rosa's family in Mexico, but Rosa herself, describing in detail what he would do to her if she didn't cooperate. The worst part was learning how Rosa had been trying to protect everyone around her. She had been giving Carlos money she couldn't afford to lose, working extra hours to try to make up the difference, skipping meals to save grocery money, all while maintaining the same cheerful facade she presented to Marcus and his family. "We're filing a police report tonight," Marcus decided. "And tomorrow, we're getting a restraining order." "Rosa, you're not going to deal with this alone anymore." As James called his contacts in the Los Angeles Police Department, Marcus sat with Rosa in her kitchen, drinking the coffee she had prepared, and trying to understand how he had missed the signs of her distress. "I should have noticed," he said. "I should have seen that something was wrong." Rosa reached across the small table and patted his hand, a gesture so familiar and comforting that it reminded Marcus of all the times she had consoled him as a teenager. "You have a big life, Marcus. Important work. I did not want to add to your worries." "Rosa, listen to me. You are not a worry. You are not a burden. You are family. And family takes care of each other." For the first time since Marcus had found her in distress, Rosa smiled genuinely. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. The police officers who came to take Rosa's statement were professional and thorough. They documented the threats, photographed the red mark on Rosa's cheek, and assured her that extortion was a serious crime that they would investigate fully. Marcus provided his contact information and made it clear that he would personally ensure Rosa had the best legal representation available. After the police left, Marcus helped Rosa clean up the glass that Carlos had broken, a small ceramic figurine that had been a gift from her sister years ago. The sight of it in pieces on Rosa's floor made Marcus angrier than all the financial threats combined. It was such a small thing, but it represented something larger. Carlos's willingness to destroy anything that gave Rosa comfort or joy. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked through his empty mansion thinking about Rosa in her small apartment, probably lying awake and worrying despite all his assurances that everything would be okay. He thought about his own life, how insulated he had become from the real struggles of the people who cared about him. His wealth had created a bubble around him, one that allowed him to remain oblivious to the very real dangers that someone like Rosa faced every day. Marcus made another decision that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to be responsible for the people you care about. He was going to make sure that Carlos never had the opportunity to hurt Rosa again. And he was going to do it in a way that would send a clear message to anyone else who might think about targeting the people Marcus considered family. But first, he was going to learn everything there was to know about Carlos Martinez and the life of crime that had brought him to Rosa's door. Marcus Chen had built an empire by understanding his opponents better than they understood themselves. Now he was going to apply those same skills to protecting the woman who had protected him when he needed it most. Marcus arrived at his office the next morning with a purpose that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or board presentations. He had spent the night researching everything he could find about domestic extortion and financial abuse, educating himself on the legal options available to protect Rosa. But he also knew that legal processes moved slowly, and Carlos didn't seem like the type of person who would be deterred by a piece of paper from the court. James Morrison was waiting in Marcus's office when he arrived, a thick folder in his hands and a grim expression on his face. Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee and settled into his desk chair, bracing himself for whatever James had discovered during his overnight investigation. "Tell me what you found," Marcus said. James opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. Carlos Martinez, 26 years old, born in Guadalajara, but has been living in Los Angeles for the past 8 years. He's got a record that reads like a criminal resume: drug possession, assault, theft, fraud. He's been in and out of jail since he was 18. Marcus studied the mugshot James handed him. Carlos looked younger in the photo, but the same calculating hardness was evident in his eyes. What's he involved in now? That's where it gets complicated, James said. Carlos isn't working alone anymore. He's connected to a crew that specializes in targeting domestic workers, particularly those who work for wealthy families. They've identified a vulnerability in the system. People like Rosa who have access to expensive homes but don't have the legal protections or social connections to fight back when they're threatened. The scope of the problem hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're saying this is organized? That Rosa isn't the only victim?" James nodded grimly. "According to my contacts in LAPD, they've been tracking at least a dozen similar cases over the past year. Housekeepers, nannies, elder care workers, all being extorted by people who claim to be family members or friends. The victims are afraid to report it because they're worried about losing their jobs or being deported if they're not citizens. It's a perfect setup for predators." Marcus felt his anger crystallizing into something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about Carlos threatening Rosa. It was about a system of abuse that targeted the most vulnerable workers in Los Angeles, people who dedicated their lives to caring for others only to be victimized because of that very dedication. "What do we know about Carlos's current situation?" Marcus asked. "Who does he owe money to?" James pulled out another document. He's in debt to a bookie named Tommy Castellanos, who runs illegal gambling operations throughout the city. Word is that Carlos owes somewhere around $50,000, money he lost betting on sports and playing poker. Castellanos isn't known for his patience with delinquent accounts. Marcus was beginning to understand the pressure Carlos was under, though it didn't excuse his actions. Desperate people often made dangerous choices, and Carlos had decided to make Rosa pay for his mistakes rather than face the consequences himself.
"There's more," James continued.
Carlos has been telling people that his rich aunt is going to solve all his problems. He's been bragging in bars and gambling halls about having access to money through Rosa's connection to your family. Some very bad people now think that Rosa is sitting on a gold mine. The implications made Marcus's blood run cold. Not only was Carlos directly threatening Rosa, but he had potentially painted a target on her back for every criminal in Los Angeles who thought she was an easy path to a wealthy family's money. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Marcus said. "The restraining order isn't going to be enough if other people think Rosa is their ticket to easy money." James agreed. "I've been thinking about that. What if we could convince Carlos and his associates that Rosa doesn't have access to the kind of money they think she does? If we could make them believe that targeting her is a waste of time, they might move on to easier prey." Marcus considered the suggestion, but something about it felt wrong. Moving the problem to someone else's door wasn't a solution. It was just passing the violence along to another innocent victim. Marcus had the resources to stop this permanently, and he was beginning to think that half measures might actually make things worse. "I want to meet with Carlos," Marcus said suddenly. James looked up from his notes, clearly surprised. "That's not a good idea, Marcus. This guy is unpredictable and potentially violent. If he sees you as an obstacle to getting money from Rosa..."
"He's gonna see me as an obstacle anyway," Marcus interrupted.
"The question is whether I'm an obstacle he understands or one that confuses him. Right now, Carlos thinks he's dealing with a scared old woman who has no one to protect her. I want him to understand exactly who he's dealing with instead." James studied Marcus's expression for a moment, clearly evaluating whether his employer was making an emotional decision that could backfire. "If you're serious about this, we need to do it right. Controlled environment, security backup, Clear objectives for what you want to accomplish. .com. Marcus nodded. Set it up. But first, I want to know everything there is to know about Carlos Martinez and the people he associates with. If I'm going to have this conversation, I want to walk in with more information than he expects me to have. While James worked on arranging a meeting, Marcus turned his attention to Rosa's immediate safety. He increased the security at his house, installing additional cameras and hiring a second guard to ensure that someone was always present during the day when Rosa was working alone. He also arranged for Rosa to stay in one of the guest rooms in the main house temporarily, moving her out of the isolated apartment where Carlos could corner her again. Rosa was initially resistant to the changes, worried that she was causing too much trouble and expense. It took considerable persuasion from Marcus to convince her that the security measures were as much for his peace of mind as for her protection. I can't focus on work knowing that you might be in danger, Marcus explained as they walked through the main house, choosing a guest room that would become Rosa's temporary residence. These changes aren't a burden. They're necessary for both of us. The guest room Marcus selected for Rosa was larger than her entire previous apartment, with its own sitting area, bathroom, and views of the garden. Rosa stood in the doorway, looking overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding her. This is too much, Marcus. I am just the housekeeper. Marcus turned to face her directly, making sure she could see the sincerity in his expression. Rosa, you are not just anything. You are the person who made sure I had a stable home when my parents were too busy to notice I existed. You are the person who taught me that kindness doesn't cost anything, but means everything. You are family, and family deserves to feel safe and valued. That afternoon, Marcus received a call from Detective Maria Santos, the police officer who had taken Rosa's statement. The tone of her voice immediately put Marcus on alert. Chen, we've been investigating Carlos Martinez, and I need to inform you that the situation may be more serious than we initially understood. Marcus put the call on speaker so James could hear. What did you find? Carlos has been arrested twice in the past month for assault, both times for violence against women. One of the victims was another domestic worker who had been refusing to give him money. The charges were dropped because the victim was too scared to testify, but the pattern is concerning. Detective Santos continued. We also discovered that Carlos has been staying in a motel about 10 minutes from your house. He's been watching Rosa's routines, learning when she's alone, when you're at work. This isn't random harassment, it's a calculated campaign. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he absorbed this information. Carlos wasn't just desperate, he was predatory, targeting vulnerable women with systematic precision. The thought of him watching Rosa, planning how to isolate and intimidate her, made Marcus angrier than he had been in years. Detective, what are our options for immediate protection? Marcus asked. The restraining order will be issued tomorrow, but honestly, Mr. Chen, restraining orders are just pieces of paper. They only work if the perpetrator is willing to obey them. Given Carlos's history and escalating behavior, I'm concerned that he might see legal action as a challenge rather than a deterrent. After the call ended, Marcus and James sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the implications of what they had learned. Carlos wasn't going to be discouraged by legal documents or increased security. He was going to keep escalating until he got what he wanted, or until someone made him stop permanently. The meeting with Carlos just became a lot more important, James said finally. Marcus agreed, but he was also thinking beyond the immediate confrontation. Carlos was part of a larger problem, one that affected vulnerable workers throughout Los Angeles. Solving Rosa's problem wouldn't help the dozens of other victims who didn't have a billionaire looking out for their interests. James, I want you to research something else for me. I want to know about organizations that help domestic workers, legal aid groups that specialize in protecting immigrants and low-wage workers. I'm thinking we might need to address this problem on a broader scale. James made notes in his ever-present notebook. You're thinking about funding a legal defense program? I'm thinking about funding a lot more than that, Marcus replied. Legal defense, security services, relocation assistance, whatever it takes to make sure that people like Carlos can't prey on workers who are just trying to make an honest living. That evening, Marcus found Rosa in her new room, sitting by the window and looking out at the garden. She had unpacked a few personal items, family photos, a small wooden cross, the kind of modest possessions that revealed a lifetime of practical choices and deep faith. How are you feeling about everything? Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap in the gesture Marcus had come to recognize as her way of processing difficult emotions. I feel ashamed, she said finally. Ashamed that I let Carlos make me so afraid. Ashamed that I brought this trouble to your family. Ashamed that I could not handle my own problems. Marcus leaned forward, struck by how thoroughly Rosa was blaming herself for being victimized. Rosa, listen to me. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Carlos is the one who should feel ashamed. He's the one who chose to threaten and intimidate you. He's the one who decided to prey on your love for your family. Rosa looked up at him, her eyes still filled with doubt.
But I should have been stronger. I should not have given him money in the beginning.
You were trying to protect your family, Marcus said.
That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And being human means sometimes getting caught in situations that are bigger than we can handle alone. That's why people need each other. They talked for another hour, with Marcus gradually helping Rosa understand that she wasn't responsible for Carlos's choices or actions. It was a conversation Marcus realized they should have had years ago, one that revealed how much Rosa had been carrying silently throughout their relationship. Tomorrow, I'm going to meet with Carlos, Marcus told her as he prepared to leave. I want to try to resolve this directly. Rosa looked alarmed. Marcus, no. Carlos is dangerous when he is angry. I do not want him to hurt you because of me. He's not going to hurt me, Marcus said, with more confidence than he felt. And I can't let him keep hurting you. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them that their target isn't as vulnerable as they thought. That night, Marcus reviewed everything James had compiled about Carlos Martinez and his associates. Criminal records, financial documents, surveillance photos, witness statements, a comprehensive picture of a young man who had chosen to live outside the law rather than face the hard work of building a legitimate life. But Marcus also saw something else in Carlos's history, a pattern of escalating violence that suggested he was becoming more dangerous over time. The early arrests had been for relatively minor crimes, but recent charges included assault with a deadly weapon and making terrorist threats. Carlos wasn't just desperate, he was losing control, becoming more willing to use violence to get what he wanted. Marcus realized that his meeting with Carlos might be the last opportunity to resolve this situation before it escalated to the point where someone got seriously hurt. Carlos needed to understand that Rosa was no longer isolated and vulnerable, but he also needed to understand that Marcus wasn't going away and wasn't going to be intimidated. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Detective Santos called at 7 a.m. with information that made Marcus's blood run cold. Mr. Chen, Carlos Martinez was arrested last night for assaulting another domestic worker. A woman named Elena Vasquez, who works for a family in Beverly Hills. According to the victim, Carlos had been demanding money from her for weeks, claiming that he knew she had access to her employer's valuables. Marcus felt sick as he listened to the details. Elena had been beaten badly enough to require hospitalization. Carlos had broken her arm and given her a concussion when she told him she had no money to give him. The good news is that Carlos is in custody, Detective Santos continued. The bad news is that bail has been set at $50,000, and his associates are already working to raise the money. He could be back on the street as early as this afternoon. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just days ago. Detective, I want to pay Elena Vasquez's medical expenses, and I want to provide legal representation for her if she's willing to testify against Carlos. Chen, but I should warn you that getting involved in another victim's case could complicate your own situation with Rosa. Then we'll handle both situations, Marcus said firmly. Carlos has been targeting multiple women, and it's time someone held him accountable for all of his crimes, not just the ones that affect my family. After hanging up, Marcus called James with new instructions. Change of plans. I don't just want to meet with Carlos. I want to make sure he understands that every woman he's threatened now has someone willing to fight for them. James was quiet for a moment, probably calculating the risks and complications of Marcus's expanded involvement. You know this is going to make you a target too, right? If Carlos sees you as the reason his victims are fighting back, let him see me as a target, Marcus said. I can afford security, legal representation, and whatever else it takes to protect myself. Rosa and Elena and all the other women he's been terrorizing can't. If he wants to come after someone, let him come after someone who can fight back. Marcus hung up and walked to the kitchen, where Rosa was preparing breakfast with her usual quiet efficiency. She looked up when he entered, and Marcus could see that despite the luxury of her new accommodations, she was still carrying the weight of fear and worry. Rosa, he said, I need you to know that this isn't just about protecting you anymore. Carlos has hurt other people, other women who are in situations similar to yours. We're going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Rosa studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her nod slowly. What do you need me to do? I need you to be brave enough to testify against him when the time comes. I need you to help other women. Understand that they don't have to face this alone. And I need you to trust me when I tell you that we're going to win this fight. Rosa reached across the kitchen island and squeezed Marcus's hand, her grip stronger than he expected. I trust you, Marcus, and I am ready to fight. Marcus realized that Rosa's courage had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of fear and cultural conditioning that told her to suffer in silence rather than cause trouble for others. All she had needed was someone to stand with her, to remind her that she didn't have to face her battles alone. The war against Carlos Martinez and everything he represented was just beginning, but Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years of corporate battles and business negotiations. He felt like he was fighting for something that mattered, protecting people who deserved protection, using his resources for a purpose that went beyond profit margins and market share. For the first time since building his empire, Marcus Chen felt like he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing with his life. The meeting with Carlos Martinez took place 3 days later in a conference room at James Morrison's security company. Marcus had initially wanted to meet at his office, but James convinced him that neutral territory would be safer and more controlled. The room was equipped with recording equipment and had multiple exit points, with James's team positioned strategically throughout the building. Carlos arrived 20 minutes late, escorted by a bail bondsman and wearing the kind of expensive street clothes that Marcus suspected had been purchased with money extorted from vulnerable workers. He looked around the conference room with obvious suspicion, his eyes lingering on the cameras and the professional setup. "This is pretty fancy for a family discussion," Carlos said as he took a seat across from Marcus. "You really went all out." Marcus studied Carlos in person, noting the differences between the man sitting across from him and the person he had encountered in Rosa's apartment. Here, in a controlled environment where Carlos couldn't intimidate or threaten, he seemed smaller somehow, less dangerous. But Marcus had read the police reports about Elena Vasquez, and he knew that Carlos's capacity for violence was real and escalating. "I wanted to have a conversation without any misunderstandings," Marcus said calmly. "I think there are some things you need to understand about Rosa and your relationship with my family." Carlos leaned back in his chair, projecting a confidence that Marcus suspected was mostly performance. "Look, Mr. Chen, I respect what you're trying to do here, protecting your employee and all that, but this is really between Rosa and me. Family business, you know? That's where you're wrong," Marcus replied. "Rosa is family to me, which means anyone who threatens her is threatening my family."
I don't think you fully understand what that means.
Carlos laughed, but there was nervousness behind it. "With all due respect, sir, you don't understand what you're getting involved in. Rosa has obligations to her real family, blood family. She's been living pretty well working for you, and now it's time for her to help the people who actually matter." The casual cruelty of Carlos's words, dismissing Rosa's years of service and loyalty as somehow less important than his demands, confirmed everything Marcus had suspected about his character. "Let me explain something to you, Carlos," Marcus said, his voice remaining level despite his growing anger. "Rosa has been part of my life for 20 years. She has given more loyalty and care to my family than some people with our actual DNA. So when you threaten her, when you hit her, when you make her afraid to exist in her own home, you're not just committing crimes, you're attacking someone I love." Carlos shifted uncomfortably, apparently not expecting the conversation to take such a personal turn. "I never hit her. That's not what happened." Marcus pulled out a photograph of Rosa's bruised cheek and placed it on the table between them. "This says otherwise. So does Elena Vasquez, who's currently in the hospital with a broken arm, courtesy of your latest conversation about family obligations." For the first time, Carlos looked genuinely surprised. "How do you know about Elena?" "Because I make it my business to know about people who prey on women who can't protect themselves," Marcus said. "Elena is getting the best medical care available, and she's getting legal representation to make sure you pay for what you did to her. Just like Rosa is getting protection to make sure you never intimidate her again." Carlos's facade of confidence was beginning to crack. "Look, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. I owe some very serious people a lot of money. If I don't pay them back soon, they're going to do things to me that make Elena's broken arm look like a paper cut." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to gamble with money you didn't have," Marcus replied without sympathy. "Your financial problems are not Rosa's responsibility, and they're certainly not an excuse to assault women who have done nothing wrong." Carlos leaned forward, his voice dropping to what Marcus assumed was supposed to be an intimidating whisper. "You think your money makes you untouchable, Mr. Malaki Chen? You think hiring some security guards is going to solve this problem? The people I owe money to, they don't care how rich you are. They care about getting paid. Marcus felt a chill of real concern, not for himself but for Rosa and any other potential victims. Carlos wasn't just working alone. He was connected to organized criminals who might be willing to escalate violence significantly if they felt their interests were threatened. Tell me about these people, Marcus said. Who exactly are you working with? That's not information you want to have, trust me. James, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, stepped forward. Actually, Carlos, we already know about Tommy Castellanos and his operation. We know about the $50,000 you owe him, and we know about the other domestic workers you and your friends have been targeting throughout Los Angeles. Carlos's eyes widened as he realized that Marcus's team had conducted a thorough investigation into his activities. You've been investigating me? We've been investigating a pattern of crimes against vulnerable workers, Marcus corrected. You just happen to be at the center of that pattern. The question now is whether you're going to help us break that pattern or become a casualty of it. Marcus opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. Bank statements, police reports, surveillance photos, and witness statements. A comprehensive record of Carlos's criminal activities over the past year.
This is what we know, Marcus said.
You owe $50,000 to Tommy Castellanos. You've been targeting domestic workers throughout the city, using family connections or fake relationships to gain access to their homes and their employers' information. You've assaulted at least 3 women that we know of, possibly more. You've been promising your creditors that you have access to money through Rosa's connection to my family. Carlos stared at the documents spread before him, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what Marcus's team had uncovered. How did you get all this? I have resources you can't imagine, Marcus said simply. The question is what we do with this information. I see 2 possibilities. Marcus leaned forward, making sure Carlos was paying attention. Option 1. You continue on your current path. You keep threatening Rosa and other women. You keep trying to use violence and intimidation to solve your financial problems. If you choose that option, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that you spend the rest of your 20s in prison. I will hire the best prosecutors money can buy. I will provide legal support for every woman you victimized, and I will use every resource at my disposal to make sure you face consequences for every crime you've committed. Carlos swallowed hard, his bravado completely gone now. What's option 2? Option 2 is that you help us shut down this entire operation. You provide information about Tommy Castellanos and his network, you testify against the people who put you in this position, and you accept responsibility for your own actions. In exchange, I'll help you get into a legitimate job training program, and I'll provide the money to pay off your debt to Castellanos on the condition that you never contact Rosa or any other member of my family again. The offer hung in the air between them, and Marcus could see Carlos struggling to process what he was hearing. It was probably the first time in his adult life that someone had offered him a path out of crime that didn't involve more violence or deception. You would pay my debt? Carlos asked quietly. $50,000? I spend more than that on flowers for corporate events, Marcus said matter-of-factly. The money is nothing to me, but the conditions are non-negotiable. You disappear from Rose's life completely. You provide full cooperation with law enforcement, and you commit to building a legitimate life instead of preying on innocent people. Carlos was quiet for several long minutes, staring at the documents on the table and clearly weighing his options. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out across his face, the temptation to take the easy money versus the fear of what might happen if he continued on his current path. How do I know you won't just have me arrested anyway once I give you information about Tommy? Carlos asked. Marcus understood the question. Trust was a foreign concept in Carlos's world, where everyone was either a victim or a predator. Because I'm not interested in revenge, Carlos. I'm interested in results. If you help me shut down this operation and protect other potential victims, then you've served a useful purpose. If you go back to victimizing women, then you become a problem I need to solve permanently. James stepped forward again. Carlos, I've been investigating criminal networks for 20 years. I can tell you that your current situation is going to end one of 3 ways. You're going to end up dead, in prison, or working with law enforcement. Mr. Chen is offering you the only option that lets you walk away with your life and your freedom. Carlos looked between Marcus and James, then back at the photographs and documents spread across the table. If I help you, if I give you information about Tommy and the others, what happens to my family in Mexico? Rosa's family? It was the first time Carlos had expressed concern for anyone other than himself, and Marcus took that as a potentially positive sign. Rosa's family will be protected. I can arrange security for them if necessary, and I can help them relocate if the situation requires it. But that protection only applies as long as you honor your agreement. The weight of the decision was clearly overwhelming for Carlos. He had spent his adult life making choices based on immediate gratification and short-term survival, and now he was being asked to think about long-term consequences and other people's welfare. I need time to think about this, Carlos said finally. You have 24 hours, Marcus replied. After that, I move forward with option 1, and you deal with the consequences of continuing to threaten the people I care about. As Carlos prepared to leave, he turned back to Marcus with something that might have been curiosity. Why are you doing this?
I mean, Rosa is just your housekeeper. You could hire a dozen people to replace her tomorrow.
Marcus felt a flash of anger at the casual dismissal of Rosa's value. But he also recognized that Carlos genuinely didn't understand the concept of loyalty that wasn't based on fear or obligation.
Carlos, you keep saying Rosa is just a housekeeper, as if that means her life has less value. Rosa has been more of a family member to me than some people who share my DNA. She's been present for every important moment of my adult life. She's shown me more kindness and consistency than most people ever experience, and she's never asked for anything beyond basic respect in return. Marcus stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. The fact that you can't understand why I would protect her tells me everything I need to know about who you are as a person. The fact that you're sitting here instead of in a jail cell tells you everything you need to know about who I am. After Carlos left, Marcus and James remained in the conference room, reviewing the recording of the conversation and planning their next steps. Do you think he'll take the deal? James asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. I think Carlos is smart enough to recognize that this is probably his only chance to avoid prison or worse. But I also think he's been living in survival mode for so long that he might not be capable of thinking beyond immediate self-preservation. And if he doesn't take the deal, then we proceed with prosecuting him for every crime we can prove, and we expand our investigation to include Tommy Castellanos and his entire network. Carlos might think he's just a small-time criminal, but he's connected to something much larger, and it's time someone disrupted that operation permanently. Marcus looked at the evidence spread across the table, thinking about Rosa and Elena, and all the other women who had been victimized by this network of predators. Carlos's decision would determine his own fate, but Marcus was committed to protecting future victims regardless of what Carlos chose. That evening, Marcus found Rosa in the garden behind his house, tending to the herb plants she had started growing in pots near the kitchen door. It was a small project, but one that seemed to give her comfort and a sense of purpose beyond her housekeeping duties. How did your meeting go? Rosa asked without looking up from the basil she was watering. Marcus sat down on a nearby bench, watching Rosa's careful attention to plants that most people would consider decorative afterthoughts. I offered Carlos a choice. He can help us stop the people who put him in this position, or he can face the consequences of continuing to hurt innocent people. Rosa nodded, her hands continuing their methodical care of the plants. And you think he will choose to help? I honestly don't know. Marcus admitted. Carlos has been making bad choices for so long that I'm not sure he remembers how to make good ones. But I wanted to give him the opportunity. Rosa finally looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. You are a good man, Marcus. Even for someone who has hurt your family, you try to find a path that does not destroy him completely. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise, knowing that his motivations weren't entirely altruistic. I'm not doing this just to be kind, Rosa. I'm doing this because Carlos is part of a larger problem, and solving the larger problem might require his cooperation. Still, Rosa said, returning to her plants, you could have chosen revenge. You could have used your money and power to simply destroy him. That you choose something more difficult, something that might actually help him become a better person. That says something about who you are. Marcus watched Rosa work in the garden as the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had endured months of fear and intimidation, had been physically assaulted and emotionally terrorized, but she was still capable of compassion for the person who had hurt her. Rosa, Marcus said, I want you to know that regardless of what Carlos decides, you're safe now. This isn't going to happen to you again. Rosa smiled, the first completely relaxed expression Marcus had seen from her since discovering the situation with Carlos. I know. For the first time in months, I feel safe in my own home. Thank you for giving me that gift. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep again, but for different reasons than before. Instead of worry and anger, he felt something approaching anticipation. Whatever Carlos decided, Marcus had learned something important about himself, and about the responsibilities that came with his wealth and influence. He had spent years building a business empire focused on connecting people across the globe, but he had somehow failed to truly connect with the people closest to him. Rosa's crisis had forced him to confront the reality that having resources meant nothing if you didn't use them to protect the people who mattered to you. 24 hours later, Carlos called with his decision. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it would change the lives of dozens of people and shut down a criminal operation that had been terrorizing vulnerable workers across Los Angeles. Carlos had chosen option 2, and Marcus Chen had chosen to fight a war that was much bigger than protecting one housekeeper from one criminal. But it was a war he was determined to win, not just for Rosa, but for everyone who had ever been victimized simply because they seemed too vulnerable to fight back. Carlos's cooperation proved more valuable than Marcus had initially hoped. Within a week of their meeting, Carlos had provided law enforcement with detailed information about Tommy Castellanos' operation, including the names of other criminals involved in targeting domestic workers throughout Los Angeles. The scope of the criminal network was staggering. Over 40 documented cases of extortion, assault, and fraud committed against housekeepers, nannies, and elder care workers across the city. Detective Maria Santos called Marcus with an update that changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. Mr. Chen, based on Carlos's information, we've been able to identify a pattern that goes beyond individual crimes.
This network has been specifically targeting undocumented workers because they know these women are afraid to report crimes to the police.
Marcus felt his anger reigniting as he absorbed the calculated cruelty of the operation.
They're using people's immigration status as a weapon against them? Exactly. Carlos admitted that they would research potential victims to find out who was most vulnerable. Women with families back home to support, workers who were supporting relatives' medical expenses, anyone who couldn't afford to lose their job or face deportation. It's systematic predation on the most vulnerable members of our community. The revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of what he was fighting against. This wasn't just about Carlos threatening Rosa. It was about an organized effort to exploit an entire population of workers who had dedicated their lives to caring for others, only to be victimized because of their generosity and dedication. Marcus made a decision that would commit significant resources but felt absolutely necessary. Detective Santos, what would it take to shut down this entire operation permanently? Not just Carlos, but everyone involved? We'd need extensive surveillance, coordinated arrests, and most importantly, we'd need victims willing to testify. The problem is that many of these women are still too scared to come forward, even with Carlos in custody. Marcus thought about Rosa's initial reluctance to report Carlos's threats, her shame and fear about bringing trouble to his family. If Rosa, who had legal status and a supportive employer, had been reluctant to seek help, women in more precarious situations would be nearly impossible to convince. What if we could guarantee protection for anyone willing to testify? Legal representation, temporary housing if necessary, immigration assistance if they need it.
Detective Santos was quiet for a moment.
That would be incredibly expensive, Mr. Chen. We're talking about potentially dozens of victims, some of whom might need long-term support. Let me worry about the expense, Marcus said. You worry about building cases that will put these people in prison where they belong. After hanging up, Marcus called James Morrison with a new assignment. I want you to research legal aid organizations, immigrant rights groups, and victim advocacy programs in Los Angeles. I'm going to fund whatever it takes to support every woman who's been victimized by this network. James whistled softly. You know this could easily cost millions of dollars, right? Legal fees, housing assistance, security services, lost wages while people testify. James, I made more in stock appreciation last week than most people make in a lifetime. If I can't use that money to protect people who are being systematically abused, then what's the point of having it? Over the next several days, Marcus threw himself into learning about the challenges faced by domestic workers in Los Angeles. He met with advocacy groups, immigration lawyers, and social workers, who opened his eyes to a world of exploitation that existed parallel to his own privileged life. Maria Gonzalez, the director of a legal aid clinic specializing in domestic worker rights, explained the scope of the problem during a meeting in Marcus's office. Mr. Bryan. Chen, what you're describing with Carlos and his associates is just one example of a much larger pattern. Domestic workers face wage theft, sexual harassment, unsafe working conditions, and intimidation on a daily basis, often with no recourse because they're afraid of losing their jobs or being deported. Marcus listened as Maria outlined statistics that made his comfortable assumptions about American labor protections seem naive and inadequate. What would it take to create real change. Not just prosecuting individual criminals, but addressing the systemic problems that make these crimes possible. Maria's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. We'd need legal advocacy for victims, education programs to help workers understand their rights, a fund to provide emergency assistance when workers are threatened, and most importantly, we'd need to change the power dynamic that leaves these women so vulnerable in the first place. Marcus found himself energized by the scope of the challenge in a way that corporate negotiations and business deals had never energized him. Tell me what that would look like in practical terms. Over the next 2 hours, Maria outlined a comprehensive program that would provide legal representation, emergency financial assistance, temporary housing, and advocacy services for domestic workers throughout Los Angeles. The program would also include education components to help workers understand their rights and resources to help employers create safer, more equitable working conditions. How much would something like this cost annually? Marcus asked. Maria looked embarrassed to discuss money with someone she assumed was looking for a modest charitable donation. A comprehensive program serving the greater Los Angeles area would probably require around $5 million per year in funding. Marcus didn't hesitate. Consider it funded. How quickly can we get this program operational? Maria stared at him for several seconds, apparently trying to process what she had just heard. Mr. Chen, are you serious? $5 million per year? I'm completely serious. And I want Rosa Martinez to be involved in developing this program. She's been through this experience, and her perspective will be invaluable in making sure we create something that actually helps people, rather than just making us feel good about ourselves.
The mention of Rosa brought Maria's attention to a question she had been too polite to ask directly.
Is Rosa the domestic worker who was being extorted by her nephew? Detective Santos mentioned that the case started with threats against someone in your household. Rosa has been part of my family for 20 years. What happened to her opened my eyes to problems I should have been aware of long ago. She's the reason I want to make sure this doesn't happen to other people. When Marcus told Rosa about the program he was funding, her reaction surprised him. Instead of gratitude or relief, Rosa looked overwhelmed by the scope of what he was proposing. Marcus, this is too much. You cannot change the world just because of what happened to me. Marcus sat down across from Rosa in the kitchen, where she was preparing dinner with the focused attention she brought to every task. Rosa, what happened to you wasn't unique. Carlos and his friends have been doing this to dozens of women across the city. What makes you think those women deserve any less protection than you received? Rosa was quiet for a long moment, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision while she processed his words. It is not that they deserve less. It is that I do not understand why you would spend so much money on people you do not even know. The question revealed something Marcus hadn't fully considered. How foreign the concept of systematic charity would be to someone who had spent their life focused on survival and family obligations rather than broader social justice. Rosa, do you remember when I was 16 and having trouble in school? When my parents were too busy to notice that I was failing chemistry and about to get kicked out of the honors program? Rosa smiled slightly, remembering. You were so angry at everyone. You said school was stupid and you did not need chemistry to run a business. And what did you do? I found a tutor. I paid for it with my own money because I knew your parents would not think it was important enough to bother with. Marcus nodded. You spent money you couldn't afford to help someone you weren't obligated to help. You did it because you saw a problem you could solve, and solving it was the right thing to do. Rosa stopped chopping and looked at him directly. That was different. You were like my own child. Maybe this isn't as different as you think, Marcus said. Maybe caring about people expands when you let it. Maybe once you care about one person beyond your obligations, you start caring about other people who are in similar situations. Rosa considered this for several minutes, her hands folded in the gesture Marcus recognized as her way of working through complex emotions. You want me to help with this program? She asked finally. I want you to help design it. You know what it feels like to be threatened and afraid. You know what kind of help would have made a difference months ago when Carlos first started demanding money. Your experience could help us create something that actually protects people instead of just making us feel good about ourselves. 3 weeks later, Rosa accompanied Marcus to the opening meeting of the Los Angeles Domestic Worker Justice Initiative. The meeting was held in a community center in East LA, in a room filled with women who looked remarkably similar to Rosa. Tired, worn down by years of hard work, but possessing a quiet dignity that spoke to their resilience and strength. Marcus had expected to feel out of place in the room, the only person present whose net worth exceeded the annual GDP of small countries. But as he listened to the women share their stories, he realized that the gap between his world and theirs was smaller than he had imagined. Elena Vasquez, the woman Carlos had assaulted, spoke about her experience with a courage that impressed everyone present. "I was afraid for so long. Afraid to report what happened. Afraid to ask for help. Afraid that speaking up would just make things worse for me and my family. But staying silent didn't protect me, it just protected the people who were hurting me." Other women shared similar stories. Financial extortion, sexual harassment, wage theft, threats of deportation used as weapons to ensure compliance with illegal or dangerous working conditions. As Marcus listened, he began to understand that what had happened to Rosa was part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that targeted women who were essential to the functioning of wealthy households, but were given no protection or recourse when they were abused. But he also heard stories of resilience and mutual support that challenged his assumptions about these women's powerlessness. They had been supporting each other informally for years, sharing information about dangerous employers, pooling resources to help each other through emergencies, and providing emotional support through crises that they couldn't report to authorities. Rosa stood up near the end of the meeting, speaking in Spanish to address the women directly. Marcus couldn't follow all of her words, but he could see the impact she was having on the room. Women were nodding, some were crying, and several approached her after she sat down to continue the conversation privately. "What did Rosa say?" Marcus asked Maria Gonzalez quietly. Maria translated. "She told them that she spent months being afraid and ashamed, thinking she had to handle everything alone. She said that when someone finally stood with her, everything changed, not just for her, but for other women who were being victimized the same way. She told them that speaking up was the scariest thing she had ever done, but also the most important." After the meeting, Rosa and Marcus drove home through the Los Angeles evening traffic, both processing what they had experienced. "How do you feel about what we're trying to do?" Marcus asked. Rosa was quiet for several minutes, watching the city lights blur past the car window. "I feel hopeful," she said finally. "And I feel ashamed that it took something happening to me personally before I understood how many other women were suffering the same way. Rosa, you couldn't have fixed this problem alone, even if you had known about it. The reason we can fix it now is because we have resources and connections that most people don't have." "But I worked in this community for 20 years, Rosa said. I knew other housekeepers, other nannies. I heard stories about bad employers, about workers being cheated or mistreated. I just told myself that was not my business." Marcus understood Rosa's guilt, but he also recognized it as a sign of her growing understanding of her own power and responsibility. "Rosa, that's exactly why this program needs your voice. You understand what it feels like to stay silent when you could have spoken up. That makes you the perfect person to help other women understand why speaking up matters." Over the following months, Rosa became one of the most effective advocates for domestic worker rights in Los Angeles. She spoke at community meetings, accompanied women to court hearings, and helped design intake procedures that made the program accessible to women who had never navigated legal or social services systems. Marcus watched Rosa transform from someone who had been victimized by the system into someone who was actively changing that system for others. Her courage in facing Carlos had been impressive, but her courage in stepping forward as a leader and advocate was extraordinary. The criminal prosecution of Tommy Castellanos and his network moved forward with testimony from 12 different victims, including Rosa and Elena. Carlos, true to his agreement with Marcus, provided detailed testimony about the operation and accepted a plea deal that involved supervised probation and community service rather than prison time. But the most significant change wasn't in the criminal justice system. It was in the community of domestic workers who had discovered their collective power to demand better treatment and protection. Women who had spent years suffering in silence were now organizing, advocating for themselves, and supporting each other through challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. Rosa's transformation amazed Marcus, but it also challenged him to think about his own evolution. He had begun this journey focused on protecting one person who mattered to him personally. But in the process of understanding Rosa's situation, he had discovered a community of people whose lives he could impact positively, and a purpose for his wealth that went beyond personal accumulation. "Marcus," Rosa said one evening as they reviewed applications for the Emergency Assistance Fund, "do you know what the best part of all this is? Tell me. For 20 years, I took care of your family. I was proud of that work, but I always felt like I was serving people whose lives were more important than mine. Now I feel like my life has importance too. Like the things I have learned, the experiences I have survived, they matter beyond just what happened to me. Marcus realized that Rosa had articulated something he had been feeling but hadn't been able to express. For years, he had measured his success by his ability to accumulate wealth and build business empires. But this work, protecting vulnerable workers, addressing systematic injustice, using his resources to amplify voices that had been silenced, felt more meaningful than anything he had accomplished in his corporate life. The billionaire who had once measured his impact in stock prices and quarterly reports was learning to measure it in lives changed and communities strengthened. And it all started with Rosa Martinez having the courage to trust someone with her problems, and Marcus Chen having the wisdom to recognize that her problems were bigger than both of them, but not too big to solve. 2 years after the night Marcus first heard Rosa's frightened voice through her apartment door, he stood in the grand ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel, surrounded by 400 of the most influential people in Los Angeles. The occasion was the second annual Domestic Worker Justice Gala, an event that had become one of the most sought-after charitable functions in the city. Marcus adjusted his bow tie and looked around the elegantly decorated room, noting the mix of technology executives, entertainment industry leaders, politicians, and social justice advocates who had gathered to support what had become the largest domestic worker advocacy program in the United States. What had started as an effort to protect one woman from one criminal had evolved into a movement that was changing labor practices and legal protections across multiple states. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the success of the program or the millions of dollars that would be raised tonight. He was thinking about Rosa, who was somewhere in this glittering crowd, preparing to receive the evening's highest honor, the Courage in Leadership Award. Recognizing her transformation from victim to advocate, to nationally recognized voice for workers' rights, Marcus spotted Rosa near the stage, surrounded by a group of women who had become leaders in the domestic workers movement. She was wearing a deep blue dress that Marcus had insisted on purchasing for the occasion, though she had initially protested that it was too expensive and too fancy for someone like her.
Watching her now, Marcus realized that Rosa had grown into the elegance of the dress and the significance of the moment.
The 2 years since Carlos's arrest had changed both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated.
The Los Angeles Domestic Worker Justice Initiative had expanded to serve over 800 workers annually, providing legal representation, emergency financial assistance, and advocacy services that had prevented dozens of situations similar to Rosa's from escalating to violence or financial ruin. Rosa had become the program's most effective spokesperson, traveling to other cities to help establish similar programs and testifying before state legislatures about the need for stronger protections for domestic workers. Her story, the housekeeper who had been too afraid to ask for help until her employer's family stood with her, had become a powerful narrative for explaining why systematic change was necessary. But Rosa's transformation went beyond her role as an advocate. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space in conversations was now confident in boardrooms and community meetings. The woman who had believed her problems were too small to matter had become someone whose voice carried weight in discussions about labor policy and immigrant rights. Marcus's attention was drawn to the stage as the evening's program began. The Master of Ceremonies, a prominent news anchor, opened with remarks about the importance of protecting vulnerable workers in an economy that increasingly relied on service labor. Marcus listened to the familiar statistics: wage theft, workplace abuse, lack of legal protections, that had once shocked him, but had now become the foundation of his understanding of economic justice. When it came time for Rosa to receive her award, Marcus watched from his table as she walked to the stage with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, but with a new sense of purpose and self-assurance that had developed through her advocacy work. Rosa's acceptance speech was delivered in both Spanish and English, addressing the room's mix of donors and community members who had come to celebrate the progress they had achieved together. 2 years ago, Rosa said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system, I was a woman who believed that my problems were too small to matter to anyone important. I believed that asking for help would make me a burden, that speaking up would cause more trouble than staying silent. Marcus found himself holding his breath as Rosa continued, knowing that her words were reaching hundreds of people who needed to hear exactly what she was saying. But I learned something that changed my life and changed the lives of many other women. I learned that courage is not about being unafraid. Courage is about believing that your life matters enough to fight for it, and that other people's lives matter enough to fight for them too. Rosa paused, looking around the room at faces that represented billions of dollars in resources and unlimited political connections. When someone finally stood with me, everything changed. Not just for me, but for my family, for other women who were being hurt the same way, and for a community that had been invisible for too long. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as Rosa's words brought back memories of that first conversation in her apartment when she had been too ashamed to admit that she was being victimized by her own nephew. "This award has my name on it," Rosa continued, "but it belongs to every woman who found the courage to speak up, every family who opened their homes to workers who needed protection, and every person who used their resources to lift up someone else instead of just lifting up themselves."
Rosa looked directly at Marcus as she spoke her final words.
Sometimes the most impossible thing is not what happens to you, it is what you choose to do about what happens to you. And sometimes the most impossible thing is discovering that your life has more value and more power than you ever imagined. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes, but Marcus barely noticed the applause or the crowd rising to their feet around him. He was thinking about the journey that had brought both him and Rosa to this moment, and about how completely it had changed his understanding of what it meant to use wealth responsibly. After the formal program ended, Marcus found Rosa in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, taking a break from the reception, where dozens of people wanted to congratulate her and discuss expanding the program to their own communities. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair beside her. Rosa smiled, the same warm expression he remembered from thousands of small moments over the past 20 years, but with a new confidence that transformed her entire presence. "I am tired, but it is a good tired. The tired that comes from doing work that matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the well-dressed crowd mingle in the lobby and discussing the evening's fundraising success. Marcus had learned to treasure these quiet moments with Rosa, conversations that had evolved from employer-employee exchanges to the kind of deep friendship that could only develop between people who had been through significant challenges together. "Rosa," Marcus said, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't told me about Carlos that day? If you had just kept trying to handle it alone?" Rosa considered the question seriously, as she always did when Marcus asked her to reflect on their shared experience. "I think about it sometimes, and I think that eventually Carlos would have hurt me badly, or I would have done something desperate to try to stop him. Either way, I would probably not be sitting here tonight." The admission was matter-of-fact rather than emotional, but it reminded Marcus of how close they had come to a very different outcome. "What do you think changed your mind about asking for help?" "You did," Rosa said simply. "Not just that day, but in the 20 years before that day. You treated me like family even when I was just the housekeeper. You made me feel like my problems would matter to you. That gave me courage to trust you when I needed help the most." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity that Rosa's words represented. "Rosa, what do you think we should do next? The program is successful, but there's still so much work to be done." Rosa's expression grew thoughtful, the look Marcus had learned to recognize as her way of processing complex possibilities. "I think we need to help other people understand what you understood. That protecting the people who work for you is not charity, it is family responsibility. Too many employers still think that paying wages is enough, that they have no obligation to care about their workers' safety or dignity." It was a sophisticated analysis of the cultural and economic changes needed to address systematic exploitation, coming from someone who had once believed her own problems were too small to mention to anyone. "I've been thinking about that too," Marcus said. "What if we created a certification program for employers? Something that recognizes households and businesses that go beyond minimum wage and basic legal requirements to actually ensure their workers' well-being and safety."
You mean like making it a mark of status to be a good employer, not just a wealthy employer? Exactly. Right now, having expensive household staff is considered a status symbol in wealthy communities. What if we made treating those staff members with exceptional care and respect an even bigger status symbol? They spent the next hour discussing practical details of how such a program might work.
With Rosa providing insights about what workers would need and want, and Marcus contributing ideas about how to make the program appealing to employers who were motivated by social status as much as by genuine care for their workers. It was the kind of collaboration that had become central to all of their advocacy work. Rosa's lived experience and community connections combined with Marcus's resources and business acumen to create solutions that addressed real problems rather than theoretical ones. As the evening wound down and guests began leaving the hotel, Marcus and Rosa walked out together, past the valets and luxury cars that represented the wealth and privilege that had funded the night's success.
"Marcus," Rosa said as they waited for their car. "There is something I want to tell you."
Something I should have said a long time ago. Marcus looked at her with concern, wondering if there was some aspect of their shared experience that Rosa had never fully expressed. "When I first started working for your family, I thought I was lucky to have a job with good people who treated me with basic respect. I thought that was enough, that I should be grateful and not expect more than a paycheck and decent working conditions." Rosa paused, looking up at the clear Los Angeles sky visible above the hotel's bright lights. "But working with you on this program, seeing how you fight for people you don't even know, understanding that you see my life as valuable as your own life, that taught me something I never learned before." "What's that?" Marcus asked quietly. "That dignity is not something you should have to earn from other people. Dignity is something you should expect, something you should demand, something you should fight for if it is not freely given." Rosa turned to face Marcus directly, her expression serious and clear.
"You did not just save me from Carlos."
"You taught me that my life has value beyond what I can do for other people. You taught me that I deserve safety and respect and the opportunity to use my voice for something important." Marcus felt overwhelmed by Rosa's words, not just because of their generosity toward him, but because of what they revealed about her own growth and self-awareness. "Rosa, you always had that dignity and value. I just helped you see what was already there." "And maybe," Rosa said with a small smile, "but sometimes people need someone else to see their value before they can see it themselves. Sometimes the impossible thing is not finding courage. It is finding someone who believes you deserve to be protected." Their car arrived, and as they settled into the back seat for the drive home, Marcus reflected on how completely this experience had changed his understanding of wealth, responsibility, and human connection. 2 years ago, Marcus Chen had been a billionaire who measured success in stock prices and market share, living an isolated life in a mansion where his only meaningful relationship was with a housekeeper he had taken for granted. Tonight, he was part of a movement that had changed labor protections for thousands of workers across the country, and his closest friendship was with a woman who had taught him that real wealth came from using resources to lift up other people. Rosa had done something that Marcus would have considered possible before knowing her story. She had transformed herself from a victim of systematic abuse into a nationally recognized advocate for workers' rights. But, more than that, she had transformed Marcus from someone who accumulated money for its own sake into someone who understood that wealth without purpose was just another form of poverty. As they drove through the familiar streets toward home, Marcus realized that Rosa's impossible achievement wasn't just her own transformation, it was her ability to help other people discover their own capacity for courage and change. Every woman who had found the strength to report abuse, every employer who had chosen to provide better working conditions, every politician who had voted for stronger labor protections, they had all been influenced by Rosa's example and advocacy. The impossible thing Rosa had accomplished was not just surviving Carlos's threats or building a successful advocacy program. The impossible thing was proving that one person's courage could ripple outward to create systematic change that protected thousands of other people. Marcus smiled as he watched Rosa review notes for a speech she would give the following week to a conference of domestic worker advocates from across the United States. The woman who had once been too ashamed to ask for help was now teaching other people how to find their voices and fight for their rights. Sometimes the most impossible transformation is discovering that your life matters more than you ever imagined. Sometimes the most impossible achievement is realizing that protecting one person can lead to protecting everyone who faces similar challenges. And sometimes the most impossible thing is learning that family isn't just about blood or obligation. It's about standing with someone when they need you most and discovering that when you protect them, you become a better version of yourself than you ever thought possible. Rosa Martinez had done the impossible. She had survived, fought back, and transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. And in doing so, she had taught a billionaire that the most valuable thing money could buy was not luxury or security for himself, it was dignity and protection for the people who needed it most. Marcus looked out at the city lights and thought about all the homes where domestic workers were now safer because of Rosa's courage. All the families who had learned to treat their employees as extended family members rather than just hired help, and all the women who would never have to face the kind of threats Rosa had endured because systematic changes had made such abuse much more difficult and much more likely to result in serious consequences for perpetrators. That was Rosa's impossible achievement, turning her personal pain into protection for others, turning her individual courage into collective power, and proving that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of leadership and change. The billionaire had learned something that no amount of money could have taught him without Rosa's example. The true measure of success was not how much you could accumulate for yourself, but how much protection and opportunity you could create for others. And the maid had taught him that lesson by doing the impossible, transforming herself from a victim into a voice that changed the world for people just like her.